Speak to the Israeli government spokesman, Eylon Levy. Thank you very much for joining us here on BBC News on our programme. Good afternoon. The Israeli Prime Minister dismissing those reports that the United States had convinced him not to expand its military activity. Are you saying that request was never actually made by the US?
We're saying that the Prime Minister decided in the aftermath of the October 7 massacre that we are going to focus first on destroying the monsters who perpetrated that massacre. We're going to focus on a policy of destroying Hamas in response to the October 7th massacre and aggressive deterrence against anyone else thinking of entering that conflict. And that is the policy that was adopted by the Security Cabinet in the immediate aftermath of that massacre on October 7th.
Just in terms of the considerations, was Israel considering a preemptive strike against Hezbollah, and that had to be dissuaded by Joe Biden's intervention?
The Prime Minister announced immediately after the October 7th massacre, we are focusing on destroying the monsters who perpetrated that massacre. We do not want to extend this conflict and fight on two fronts. And we've been warning from the very beginning that we do not want to fight on two fronts. But, you know, the situation in the north now is escalating as Hezbollah appears hellbent on dragging Lebanon into a totally needless war. And we are warning now that UN Security Council Resolution 1701 from 2006 must be implemented. That resolution is supposed to keep the peace by keeping the Iran-backed Hezbollah militias away from the northern border. Unfortunately, now they've been stepping up mortar attacks that have destroyed half of the houses in a village called Manara on the Israeli-Lebanese
So
border.
are you saying you're now considering again action against Hezbollah?
We are saying that the situation in the north, with 80,000 Israelis who have been displaced, is intolerable. We are trying to deter Hezbollah from dragging us into a war, but unless and until an effective diplomatic solution is found based on UN Security Council Resolution 1701, we will continue making the necessary preparations to repel this threat from our northern border.
OK, let's talk about what's happening on the Gaza Strip. Why do you think it is that Joe Biden again had to remind Israel of the critical need to protect civilians?
President Biden has been a stalwart supporter from day one when he said that if the United States had faced the sort of massacre that we had on October 7th, its response would be swift, decisive and overwhelming.
Sure, that's not the question I asked you, though, is it? Why, again, has America, the president, had to remind you to protect civilians?
We've talked the Americans through the very rigorous steps that we take in selecting targets and showing them how we are going after the monsters who perpetrated the October 7th massacre. Unfortunately, in the Gaza Strip, Hamas is playing a very cynical and evil game. It has spent 16 years embedding itself under schools, under homes, under hospitals, in a deliberate strategy to hide behind civilians and evade justice and make it impossible to apprehend them after they attack our people. And what we're doing is trying to get civilians out of harm's way so we can go after the monsters who perpetrated the October 7th massacre.
Yeah, you say that you're doing everything you can, but we have 20,000 plus Palestinians killed since October the 7th. Your own estimate suggests between about 5,000 and 6,000 Hamas fighters included in that number. That's a terrible ratio of about 4 to 1 civilians, isn't it?
Well, according to the numbers you just quoted, it would be 3 to 1. And when you compare that to other Western counterterrorism campaigns in urban areas, the UK and the US in Afghanistan, Iraq and ISIS, the ratio actually shows very clearly the extent that Israel is going to try to protect civilians.
You say that, but a visual investigation by...
To remind everyone, sorry, if I could just add this, you asked me why the Americans have to keep reminding people. Secretary Blinken says at every opportunity, this war can end tomorrow if Hamas surrenders and lays down its arms. And we think that anyone who is concerned for civilians in Gaza, as we are, should be demanding that the monsters who burned, beheaded and raped innocent Israelis on October 7th surrender immediately and return all the hostages. And this war can be over at once. No one else needs to be hurt.
A visual investigation by the Washington Post found that more buildings had been destroyed in the first 7 weeks of this war than in Aleppo in 3 years. You're destroying civilian infrastructure. You're destroying Gaza, aren't you? Not just Hamas.
It is tragic that Hamas spent the 16 years in which it governed Gaza, instead of trying to serve the people of Gaza, building its bunkers and its tunnels underneath schools.
But I'm talking about, I'm sorry, I'm talking about what you are doing. There was a piece in Haaretz in Israel only a couple of days ago which described the whole point of the IDF spokesperson's unit was to put, quote, lipstick on nonsense. That is what you're doing now, isn't it? Lipstick on nonsense.
No, I'm not putting lipstick on nonsense. The people putting lipstick on nonsense are those trying to cover up for Hamas deliberately embedding itself under civilian areas. Hamas has a deliberate strategy of trying to use human shields. It builds tunnel shafts under children's beds, it stores rockets in mosques, it builds its command centers under hospitals, and then when Israel goes after these legitimate military targets, people complain that Israel shouldn't be attacking them, as if terrorists should be given immunity just because they choose to hide under civilian infrastructure.
No one is saying that. They're just questioning your basic tactics. Benjamin Netanyahu has also said a message to Hamas saying, you either surrender or die. How do you think that helps in terms of hostage releases?
We think that the only action the UN Security Council should have taken after the deadliest terror attack since 9/11 is to demand that the perpetrators surrender immediately, lay down their arms, turn themselves over for a war crime tribunal.
I'm simply asking you a question about what your Prime Minister has said, surrender or die. How does that help in terms of actually reaching that objective of hostage releases?
Because our policy is to put unrelenting military pressure on Hamas to release those hostages. And that strategy vindicated itself with the last hostage release pause. Because in exchange for giving back hostages, what did Hamas want? It wanted a breather. It wanted a few days of a pause in the fighting. And then on December 1st, Hamas decided to violate the framework we had in place, stop releasing all of the women and children who are still trapped in its terror dungeons, and resume its rocket attacks against Israel. And our policy now is to continue putting unrelenting military pressure on Hamas, because standing by the sidelines was never an option. We are creating the conditions for Hamas to be willing to release the hostages it has brutally abducted and is holding without any access to the Red Cross, in flagrant violation of humanitarian law and every norm of human decency for those vulnerable hostages trapped in those terror dungeons.
Let me ask you about advice to civilians, because another 150,000 people have been told to evacuate central areas of Gaza earlier today. UNRWA's director said people in Gaza are people, not just pieces on a checkerboard. Many have been displaced several times. The Israeli army is just ordering people to move into areas where there's ongoing airstrikes. Nowhere is safe. There is nowhere to go. And that is the basic predicament for civilians, not Hamas, but civilians caught up in this conflict, isn't it?
No, let me correct you. Israel has been urging civilians from the very beginning to move to a designated humanitarian zone. We designated the Al-Mawasi zone as a humanitarian zone because Hamas has not already embedded itself there. We think it is tragic that international aid agencies have been complicit with Hamas's human shield strategy by diverting people into Hamas strongholds where it can hide behind them instead of sending them to the humanitarian zone. We also think it is outrageous that after Hamas has fired over 100 rockets out of the zone at our communities, not a single UN agency can condemn Hamas for firing rockets at our civilians from areas where we want their civilians to be safe. Civilians must be protected, and if we're going to protect civilians, we need international agencies to help get them to areas we have designated as safe, because Hamas is not operating out of there, instead of playing along with Hamas's human shield strategy and making themselves culpable in its despicable attempt to maximize casualties on its own side.
They would contest every part of what you've said as they continue to operate in terms of the humanitarian situation on the ground. And I won't rehash what the UN and the Secretary-General has said in successive statements. We have to leave it there, but thank you very much for joining us here on BBC News. Thanks for your time.
Thank you. Merry Christmas.